100 books in the past year, and today I want to share with you the best nonfiction that I read from my perspective, including the number one most important one that I honestly think everyone should read. Now, before I go into this, when it comes to nonfiction authors, I feel like it's important to mention that just because I found value in these books doesn't mean I support everything that these authors have ever said or done. I don't need authors to be perfect human beings. I'm really just basing it off of whether these books brought value to my life. And frankly, I don't know everything controversial that any of these people might have said or done. I just know that typically with nonfiction, it's a little bit of a risk that people have opinions on the people who wrote the nonfiction book. All of these will be in my recommended books list on Amazon down below if you want to check it out, but let's get straight into it. So starting off with psychology-related books. Attached by Amir Levine and Rachel Feller is a really good introductory book if you want to learn more about attachment style. Particularly, it goes into different myths about attachment style, like that we should all be non-attached to each other. I did actually make a whole video about myths of attachment style that I got from this book. And I think this book is particularly helpful for insecure, anxiously attached folks who keep getting into relationships with insecure, avoidantly attached people. A weak point of it is that it really didn't go into disorganized attachment style at all. So I thought that it wasn't completely comprehensive. It was just kind of like if you're dipping your toes into attachment style. Up next, we have Flourish by Martin Seligman. Martin Seligman is the father of positive psychology, and if you read this book, you will hear right from the horse's mouth about the research on what makes people the happiest, including concrete techniques to help you get there. Like, based on the research, what are the techniques that are shown to be helpful for people? But it's not just about what makes people happier, it's also about what helps them live more meaningful, fulfilling lives, because his more recent research updates his original happiness theory to encompass a broader, more sustainable goal than just being happy all the time. That's not really the point of positive psychology. Then we have The Case Against the Sexual Revolution by Louise Perry. As someone who did her dissertation study on college women's experiences in hookup culture, I found this book to be a really important conversation starter on some of the lies of female empowerment that we were sold by the sexual revolution, and some of the ways in which men have hijacked the sexual revolution to better benefit themselves. My main gripe with this book, however, is that it touts evolutionary psychology in a way that I find highly flawed. For example, I can't say this word, so I'm going to say a word that's adjacent to it, okay? Don't get mad at me. Part of Louise Perry's thesis is that grape is actually about sexual attraction and not power like everyone tends to think it is. I don't think that that holds up. Just because men who commit these crimes tend to choose victims who are of childbearing age does not mean that grape is about attraction or some natural instinct. If someone wants to break into a home, for instance, of course they're going to choose the most expensive looking home. But that does not mean that they were motivated by the finery there. They were motivated by the desire to take what was not theirs. If someone decides to get into a bar fight, of course they're going to choose the person that most angers them. But that doesn't mean that they were really triggered by that person angering them. They were really looking for a fight. And of course, I think it goes unsaid that there are plenty of victims of sexual violence who do not fit the attractive woman of childbearing age mold. So I just don't love this argument. My secondary gripe with her book was that some of her solutions were lacking and honestly depressing. Like, get married and stay married. Really? Is that the best solution that we can offer to people? I feel like we can do a little bit better. And actually, a lot of the book was kind of depressing and framed men as naturally, evolutionarily, inherently sexually predatory, which I don't think is constructive and I think is quite fatalistic. I realize this is like favorite books of 2024, and I'm kind of drilling home that there are a lot of things I disagreed with in the book. But like I said, I can disagree with a lot of what's in it and still find a lot of value in it, particularly because I think she says something about the sexual revolution in this book that not a lot of people say. And I think it's a really fresh perspective that we need to have more often. Up next, we have Atomic Habits by James Clear. This one is very well known, and I think it's for very good reason. I already knew a lot of the methods in it, but I also learned a few things in particular that were helpful for fine-tuning your environment for success, to basically just make it easier for you to follow through with your desired action rather than having to work so hard at it. So I can see why this one's a bestseller. Then we have Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway by Dr. Susan Jeffers. Dr. Susan Jeffers was a psychologist who seems to have had a really healthy, resilient outlook on life based on what I've read in this book. I would say it's about the importance of getting out of your comfort zone, thinking positive, being resilient, and in a lot of ways it's aligned with Stoic philosophy. In fact, I think there are even a couple of pages where she mentions Stoicism, so that one was a real treat to read. Then there's The Gift of Fear by Gavin de Becker. This one was written by, I think, a private investigator who helps stalking and harassment victims, and he really emphasizes the importance of trusting your intuition when it comes to keeping yourself physically safe from predators. It's powerful, life-saving stuff. I honestly think every woman should read it. Then there's The Magic of Thinking Big by David Schwartz. This one also is kind of a hodgepodge of tips for developing a healthier, more resilient, more optimistic mindset in all areas of your life, but I think it's particularly important to material goals, things like financial goals. Has a lot of tips for kickstarting creativity, sticking with progress, and so forth. Then there is Forged in Darkness by Dr. Joanna Laprade. She is a Jungian psychotherapist, and this whole book is basically just a metaphor for diving into the underworld of our psyche by working through our most painful, traumatic experiences rather than avoiding going into the depths. And all the while, she draws from classical mythology to show the different ways that we can show up in our underworld journeys as heroes. It's kind of like a modern day Women Who Run with the Wolves, but instead of the wild woman archetype, it's about diving headfirst into the unconscious. And the last book in the psychology section, and this is the #1 nonfiction book that I read this year, The Coddling of the American Mind by Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt. Now, I just recorded an entire video on this book today, so I'm not sure which is coming out first, this video or the one I'm talking about. But if the video review has come out on my psychology channel, I'll pin it up here. If it hasn't yet, then I'll just pretend to pin it up here. But basically, it's about the 3 great untruths, as they call it, that are plaguing America's youth. The untruth of fragility, that what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. The untruth of emotional reasoning, that you should always trust your feelings no matter what. And the untruth of us versus them, which is that there are good people and evil people in the world. I think it is a book that every single American, maybe even every single person, should read. It's just so rich with insights, and honestly, it might trigger you in some ways, but I think it's really, really important. Now, in the money/finance section, honestly, they all kind of blend together at some point, but there is one that kind of stuck out as more helpful than the others, and that was I Will Teach You to Be Rich by Ramit Sethi. Out of all the money books I read this year, I think this one was the most helpful and the funniest written. And actually, I found out that both my husband and I happened to be subscribed to his newsletter. I was like, oh, you're subscribed to him? I am too. And that says a lot because I don't subscribe to a lot of newsletters, but you should subscribe to my newsletter so that you can find out when my next novel's out. It has a lot of just no fuss tips to level up your financial success, all with a very no excuses attitude. I have 2 videos already on all the money books that I've read in the past year or so check those out if you're interested in a deeper dive into finance books in general. Now, in terms of the spiritual type of books, The 7 Laws of Spiritual Success by Deepak Chopra kind of bridges the material with the spiritual. This was my introduction to Deepak Chopra, and I really loved this book. It was short and sweet. It really resonated with me on a spiritual level in terms of like, yeah, it makes sense that these are the laws of the universe. However, the more I learn about Deepak Chopra and the more of his work I read, the more I think this book was kind of a fluke for me. And I think some of his teachings are outlandish, to tell you the truth. Then there is Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, which is my favorite Stoic text to date. This one's really easy to digest. It most resonated with me. It's a good intro to Stoicism once you've kind of got the foundations down. Like, I do recommend, if you're diving headfirst into Stoicism, maybe start with like an introduction of what it is, a modern day introduction. And then once you really dive into the classics, this is a good one to pick up. And then lastly, Why Woo Woo Works by David Hamilton. I put this one under spirituality, but it could also partly go under psychology. It's basically a rundown of the research behind why certain woo-woo practices work for people. I found it to be a lot more fair, nuanced, and credible than a lot of the other spirituality gurus books out there. And it's written by an actual scientist, so it kind of makes sense why I found it more credible. It also had some really interesting, kind of tangential insights into the nature of consciousness and different theories about that honestly still stuck with me to this day. So that was a really cool book. These were my favorite nonfiction books that I read this year. I will be coming out next week with my favorite fiction books that I read this year. What were your favorite books that you read this year? Let me know in the comments down below, and I'll see you soon.